Good afternoon and welcome to the Honors Residential College. We still have some seats here on the sides and on the front. If you need a seat later on, there's still some also here over towards the middle. We are so thrilled to have you here in the Honors Residential College as part of our formation series. We're thrilled this year that the Drumwright Family Lecture is a part of our formation series. My name is Jason Witt. I have the great privilege of serving as the faculty steward for the Honors Residential College. We have about 300 of our honors students who call this place home. We hope to believe is a kind of central hub and a front porch for our honors college. We welcome in not only our students, but all students in the honors college and from broader Baylor, as well as those of you who are visiting with us. We are so glad that you have been here this afternoon. The Formation Series is our community's ongoing conversation around our theme. And each year that we have select speakers. We are thrilled this year with our speaker. Before I introduce Dean Henry up here, I would like you to notice we do have snowflakes around the walls. This was part of our Yule Ball, but even more, and as you know, this is way too early. It's before the start of Advent. There should be no Christmas decorations up. However, these also serve to remind us that right now the Honors Residential College is leading and inviting all of you to join us in supporting Operation Christmas Child. We have buckets around our hall and some buckets across the university where we're needing toys and other items. There's a list of things. Tomorrow night we will be packing hopefully 100 boxes to go to children with toys, with clothing, with pencils, school supplies. It's a big thing we do every year before decorating the rest of our halls. So if those of you are part of Baylor University, if you're in the Honors College, one of our programs or it's not, you are looking for some place to give, please see those buckets and see some needs. And if you could drop some items in there, we'll make sure and get those to children. But once again, thank you for joining us here in the Honors College, for being a part of this conversation this afternoon. And now I want to introduce Dean Henry.
Jason, thank you. I know most of you. My name is Doug Henry. I'm Dean of the Honors College. And on behalf of the Honors College, our 1,400 or so students and the gifted faculty and staff who mentor and teach them, welcome. We serve Baylor's mission. And I often joke, they don't send people like me away to Dean School to learn the mission. It comes naturally. So can we say it all together? No, just kidding. Baylor's mission is to educate men and women for worldwide leadership and service by integrating academic excellence and Christian commitment within a caring community. That mission takes expression within the college by way of a vision whereby we love truth, kindle faith, and cultivate virtue in friendship, study, and service to Christ and neighbor. So I say that to provide a context for this lecture series, the Drumwright Family Lecture, which was made possible through the generosity of Minette Drumwright Pratt and her family and friends. Minette, many of you will know, passed away last year. We're delighted to see Debbie, her daughter, and Max, her son-in-law, here with us. We miss her, as I know you do too, but rejoice that she's in the faithful arms of our Lord. The Drumwright Family Lecture Series has long taken as its subject themes that are related to and that grow out of the wisdom and riches of the liberal arts tradition, which we, consistent with our mission, believe find their full amplitude within the light of Christ. And so as you look back over the series of speakers and the series of titles through the years, I think many of those are listed in your program, you'll see that as a consistent theme over time. It has been a series, Max and Debbie, that has edified our community, provided cause for the kind of inquiry and thought and conversation that we think are proper to an honors college such as we aspire to be. So thank you for that. And welcome all of you into this conversation, which has endured across a far longer stretch of time than Baylor or the Honors College or this lecture series. And to help us take next steps into that age-old, perennially important conversation, I'm going to welcome forward Elizabeth Corey, who will offer the final word of introduction and welcome, and then we will make way for our distinguished guest, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Dean Henry. It's a pleasure to be able to welcome you all here to this lecture, and especially to Dr. Jennifer Frey on this gorgeous fall afternoon. I have known Jen for several years now, and we've conferred on many things having to do with liberal arts education and honors education in particular. Dr. Frey started an honors college herself, built from the ground up in less than 2 years at the University of Tulsa. She's currently a professor of philosophy at the University of Tulsa, and she lectures widely across the country. I looked at her vita, and to give you a sense of her pace, she has had 15 public lectures this year so far and still more to go. I don't quite know how she's doing that. She hosts a popular podcast called Sacred and Profane Love, and she writes for both scholarly and popular outlets. Most relevant for us, though, in the Baylor Honors College is that she's deeply concerned with the character of liberal education in the modern academy, what it's for, why we should do it, and how we might maintain and support it in a world that seems increasingly not to value this kind of education. We often hear that college is above all a path to a well-paying job, and that what matters most are the future earnings of our graduates. But Dr. Frey and I suspect almost all of us here, maybe everyone, think that there's something much more fundamental about the goods of liberal education than jobs, prestige, and honor. The Latin phrase esse quam videre, translated roughly to be rather than to seem, points towards some of these goods: character, happiness, virtue, the state of our souls in general, and the right ordering of loves. And I suspect that many of these topics will be discussed this afternoon. So let's welcome Dr. Frey to Baylor.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yeah, we're good? Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation to come and deliver this lecture. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here at Baylor's Honors College. My daughter, Gianna, just to embarrass her, is here as a prospective Honors College student. I am somewhat of a professional critic these days of our universities. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that I think that Baylor Honors is something very special and unique and is getting it right. So I'm very happy to be here. The title of my talk poses the question, why are we here? Of course, since I'm a philosopher, I'm asking the question not in an ordinary common sense way, but in a sort of normative register. So no matter what anyone thinks is the reason they should be here, the question that I'm posing is, what is the true reason that ought to motivate them to attend a university? To what should the university as an institution of higher education aspire? What is its governing goal and why? Now, many of you think, perhaps not in this room, I don't know, but certainly our society trains us to think that we are here to deliver the credentialing necessary to prepare students for some viable and hopefully lucrative career. I want to insist that this is not the essential reason why we are here at a university. Rather, I want to suggest that we are here first and foremost to pursue wisdom. It's going to take a while for me to arrive at that conclusion, and I'm going to frame my asking of the question, why are we here, by setting up a contrast between two different and competing visions of what sort of knowledge is essential to the university, both in its pursuit or aspiration and also in its production. So the first sort of vision of the gold standard of university knowledge was advocated by Max Weber, and the other is advocated by Cardinal John Henry Newman, now a saint and doctor of the church. But let's start with Weber. So in 1917, the great sociologist Max Weber was invited by a group of university students to Munich to launch a lecture series on intellectual work as a vocation. The students were members of the Free Student Alliance. This was a group that championed the idea of the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, Bildung or moral education, and academic freedom, during a time when these ideals were under immense pressure from disciplinary specialization, state intervention, market pressures, and a world war. Addressing about 100 students in a lecture hall, Weber gave an address that was surely unwelcome to them. Because rather than give a defense of their lofty ideals, which is presumably why he was invited, Weber gave an account of scholarship as mere expertise, undertaken with no ultimate horizon of meaning, purpose, or goal. So Weber embeds his very famous notion of scholarship within his more general diagnosis of modernity as a period of what he calls disenchantment. Now, enchantment for Weber is connected to magic. If you wanted a very literal translation of the German, it would be demagiccation. Whatever is magical, on Weber's view, is whatever cannot be shoehorned into the ontologies, epistemologies, or calculative rationalities of the natural and social sciences. The modern university is an institution that reflects this basic condition of modernity, and that's going to dictate what sort of knowledge it's legitimate to pursue within it. So within the terms of demagiccation, Weber argues that all that scholarship could be is specialized expertise of a very narrow form. So, quote Weber, "In the present era, scholarship in both sciences and the humanities has entered an apparently permanent phase of specialization unlike anything that has gone on before. We can feel sure that we have achieved something of real scholarly value only insofar as we have specialized to the utmost degree." Weber argues that the scholar is a professional expert who labors in the service of increasing our repository of objective facts. He's emphatic that it is not a, quote, gift of grace with seers and prophets dispensing holy objects and revelations, nor a part of a sage's or a philosopher's meditations on the meaning of life. In fact, real scholarship leaves totally unasked questions, meaning, and value. This presumably can be left to the priests and the prophets, but it is certainly not the business of the scholar, and any suggestion to the contrary reeks of either the charlatan or the demagogue. Weber further yokes the notion of scholarly work to a technical notion of progress that is unending. What's noteworthy to me about Weber's notion of progress is that it has no transcendent horizon that would make it worthy, right, to pursue for its own sake. So then, what does he think the meaning or value of scholarly work is? Well, he does have an answer to the question, and it has three parts. First, scholarship ought to give us more techniques for calculating and controlling life, thus helping us to master nature. Second, scholarship gives us methods of thinking, the kinds of thinking that are internal to disciplinary knowledge. So think about analytic skills that sharpen the mind. It's good to have a sharp mind. Third, scholarship gives us clarity about the means to whatever ends we have adopted for ourselves. But what scholarship emphatically does not do and should not do is tell us which ends we should pursue, or deign to think that it could help us make serious judgments in that domain. And that's because to render a judgment of value would be demagoguery or an abuse of power by the scholar. This is the inevitable result of the forces of Weberian disenchantment or demagiccation, which creates a situation in which the ultimate and most sublime values have retreated from public life and are simply a matter of private choice. Weber has nothing to say about teaching other than to note that excellence in scholarship is causally unrelated to excellence in teaching. And who besides overgrown children, he asks, believes that advancing in scholarship tells us anything about the meaning of the world? Rather, and this is another quote, if scholarship can do anything, it is precisely to uproot and destroy the belief that the world has any such meaning. Now, one question that presents itself when reading Weber is, all right, well, what disciplines then can count as science, as Wissenschaft? Well, Weber is helpfully clear that theology is not going to make the cut because it violates the terms of disenchantment as he has outlined them, and so it doesn't belong in the modern university. So here's Weber again. All theology is an intellectual rationalization of religion's sacred domain. Every theology presupposes that the world must have a meaning and asks how to interpret this meaning so that it might be graspable by the human mind. On the other hand, Weber is totally cool with the academic study of religion, but that does not go further than describing the meaning that various world religions have purported to find, right? So it's a kind of factual analysis of that. But anything more than that sort of alienated or merely academic mode of inquiry would bring the magical into the disenchanted halls of the academy. I think it's sort of unclear what he would say about my own discipline of philosophy, but certainly we might guess that he would not think highly of my own intellectual labors on wisdom, happiness, virtue, and the meaning of life, as I have purported to say true things about such matters and presented up my arguments for rational debate. So why care about Weber? Well, because there are a lot of contemporary Weberians, and I think that universities tend to operate in a sort of Weberian mode, whether they think of it this way or not. But the most prominent contemporary Weberian is Stanley Fish. So in his book, Save the World on Your Own Time, Fish argues that the trouble universities are in today is that professors want to do someone else's job and not limit themselves to doing their own job. So what is the professor's job? He only has two roles, according to Stanley Fish. One, introduce students to bodies of expert knowledge and traditions of inquiry. Two, equip students with the analytical skills that will enable them to move confidently within those traditions and engage in independent research about them if they wish to do so. That's it. That's your only job. Now, Fish is silent about what bodies of knowledge and traditions of inquiry students need to engage, or why they would need to engage them, as he must be, as this would involve a value judgment, which is forbidden. But he is clear that no matter what you study, and really study what you want, you must remain distanced from the material as merely academic, thus ensuring that the stakes are very low for everyone involved. So professors and students can analyze, right, and assess arguments and claims together. We can interpret and debate the strengths of the positions of other people. But what we professors cannot and should not do is encourage our students to engage in a kind of personal search for what they believe is ultimately true about the most important questions in human life. Fish's defense of the quite limited job of the academic is that the university is the institution dedicated only to the pursuit of truth, and that the pursuit of truth must be a merely academic enterprise that has nothing to do with soulcraft. Students, he insists, are not on a quest for wisdom, meaning, or purpose, or any other such highfalutin goals. Indeed, Fish mocks those who would pretend to be, quote, wise men, gurus, or saviors. The professor's only obligation, again, is to present the academic material on the syllabus and introduce students to the, quote, state-of-the-art methods of analysis of some form of disciplinary knowledge. Or, as he once said to me directly, in a correspondence issue of the Lamp magazine, and now I'll just quote Fish, he's responding to my work, "It is always possible to ask of any text questions such as, does it contribute to the building of a better society, or expand the amount of freedom in the world, or strike a blow against the forces of darkness? But the moment a professor goes down any of those paths, he is no longer an academic, but has become a political or a moral agent. Being an academic means not being free, to say a whole host of things, lest you venture into territories and kinds of actions unrelated to either your competence or responsibility. My job is not to make my students more free, whatever that would mean, but to make them more knowledgeable." That might seem too humble a job description for Dean Frey. She wants to be noble. I simply want to be professional. Imagine someone saying this to Plato about his academy, or to Socrates, who gave his life for the sort of inquiry Fish openly mocks. At any rate, let us try to see how Fish might understand my own disciplinary knowledge of philosophy. In a moral philosophy class, he insists, students are not, as the ancients might propose, engaged in a practical science that should change how they understand themselves and live. No, they are learning the ways that philosophers have structured their inquiries and reflections about morality over some period of time, perhaps only very recent. What makes moral philosophers worth studying is not the answers they give, but, quote, the verbal, architectonic, or argumentative skills they display in their writing. Fish writes, the genuine inquiry in which students are engaged is not an inquiry about what kind of person they should be, but an inquiry about what kind of person Plato or Hobbes or Rawls or Milton thought they should be and for what reasons, full stop. Exams, then, must only test knowledge of Plato, not knowledge of what is true, considering what Plato has argued. Why it is important to know what these dead men have said about the good life is left totally unaddressed and somewhat mysterious. In the end, Fish says that he's defending the limitations and prohibitions of what he calls the research ideal. But he is weirdly blind to or uninterested in the fact that this ideal is an invention of the mid to late 19th century, so fairly recent in the history of the university, let alone the academy. And I think it's safe to say that this neo-Weberian approach hasn't been awesome for humanistic modes of inquiry generally, certainly not for the love of my life in particular, philosophy. It seems to me, however, that an actual history of higher education in this country matters to how we think about its present and its future. So if you will indulge me for just a few minutes, I want to give a brief rundown of that broader context. So if you know anything about higher education in the United States, you know it began with small liberal arts colleges run by clergy and grounded in a classical curriculum taught by tutors rather than specialized professors. And this went on for roughly 200 to 250 years without much comment. Students were expected to receive a liberal education that prepared them for any variety of fields or occupations, and thus they studied subjects like rhetoric, logic, philosophy, classical languages, math, science, and ancient history. The curriculum was entirely prescriptive. Students studied what the president of the college thought they must, and yes, the president taught. Tutors understood their purpose to make their pupils happy and virtuous men of order and industry. Capstone courses for graduating seniors were naturally in moral philosophy or theology. Tutors and college presidents understood themselves as basically acting in loco parentis for the young men that filled their campuses, and the moral formation of these pupils was paramount to the entire enterprise. They were engaged in forming good human beings and citizens, or at least they were trying to do this. Results varied. Now, the German influence on higher education in the mid to late 19th century caused a sea change in how universities organize, understand, and evaluate themselves. By the late 19th century, the CV became the basis of hiring, and the seminar became the dominant form of university instruction. The telos of the university was similarly transformed. It was now to create new knowledge, rather than to pass on received wisdom, modes of enculturation, or the cultivation of personal morals. Now, this change in the university's self-conception obviously necessitated a change in the curriculum and the basic structure of the university. Universities, beginning with the oldest, Harvard, switched from a prescribed to an elective system. The elective system eventually gave rise to the now familiar balkanization of knowledge into majors and minors, and along with that, a massive explosion of departments and fields of inquiry, all of which was based on the idea that the students' passions or inclinations or political projects should be the basis of a university education rather than an ideal. Now, one important part of this overall transformation of the university's self-conception was the creation of the contemporary professoriate as we know it, of which I am a member. The self-conception of the professor as a knowledge worker is born. So a good professor is measured by his publication record and his impact in the field. The adoption of a publish or perish mandate meant that facially neutral measures of meritocratic success in the university became yoked to the production of disciplinary knowledge. Now, the best professors will be rewarded by having little to no teaching responsibilities. Undergraduate education becomes something of an afterthought, and the general education curriculum, a mostly incoherent set of requirements that might be addressed within a variety of disciplines, was delegated to a kind of underclass, right? Graduate students, adjuncts, permanent lecturers, people whose power and reputation within the university were nothing compared to their high research-focused counterparts on the tenure track. Generalists disappear. Wisdom, not surprisingly, disappears as a norm as well, and is replaced in the best case by truth, but more commonly other ends crowded in as the goal of inquiry, especially as some disciplines began to question the concept of truth as a norm, and rather began to see it as just another vehicle for domination and control of other people. Now, what's my point in rehearsing that quick and dirty version of higher education in the US? I point it out because if Fish and Weber are correct, then the liberal arts college ideal was always a weird and illegitimate medieval holdover, and only the research ideal is defensible in our new age of disenchantment and alienation from ultimate ends and forms of knowledge that go beyond mere expertise. Now, I think what's strange about Stanley Fish in particular is that he actually insists that the research ideal has Aristotle and John Henry Newman as its forerunners. But I think Aristotle's conception of liberal education and Newman's idea of a university, which is very explicitly based on it, could not be further from this research ideal and knowledge worker that is put forward by Weber and Fish. So I want to turn to Aristotle and Newman to make my contrast complete. So Newman's idea of a university is written in 1852, so that's 12 years before Max Weber was born. And it's a series of lectures. And in these lectures, Newman advocates for the ideal of a university that is based primarily in what he calls liberal knowledge, that is liberal and that it is sought for its own sake, and also because he argues it cultivates a habit of mind that befits a free person. For Newman, a university is concerned first and foremost not with the production or advancement of knowledge, but its diffusion and extension. Now, obviously, Cardinal Newman is a doctor of the church and a theologian, but I want to stress the following. His definition of a university has nothing essentially to do with Christianity or the Catholic Church. The university is defined by Newman as follows. It is an institution dedicated to liberal education and thus to seeking and teaching what he calls universal knowledge. That's it. Liberal education and universal knowledge. Newman is most concerned that the university be a place where the whole of liberal knowledge is presented and handed on. It's not simply that no part of this knowledge can be left out, although it shouldn't, but that this knowledge must form a whole or be comprehended as a unity. So like Weber, Newman speaks of knowledge in terms of facts, but unlike Weber, he thinks that we can know facts beyond what strictly empirical methods might deliver. He thinks, for example, we can have knowledge through intuition, through testimony, through abstract reasoning from first principles, and he gives credence to tradition as an authority that must be consulted even as our views develop naturally over time. By whatever licit means we come to have such factual knowledge, it will fit into a larger system or unified account of what can be known. So truth is not simply grasping of facts or making true assertions about particulars, but more importantly, understanding these facts in relation to one another as a unified totality, or part of a kind of comprehensive universal system. Newman also has an idea of progress, but it's very different from Weber's. So for Newman, it's about making advances towards seeing how the parts of truth relate to this greater whole of truth. And behind this idea of truth is a conception of what he calls the universe, the totality of being or reality, as something that is intrinsically intelligible or knowable by us. And this is like the main point for Newman. There can be no universal knowledge without this conception of a universe, and there can be no university without universal knowledge. So if we accept this model of universal knowledge as a kind of ideal towards which the university ought to strive in its varying intellectual endeavors, then we can start to see how all the various disciplines taught within the university ought, at least in principle, to bear upon one another. Right? So you have all these different sciences or forms of knowledge, but as knowledge, they ought to contribute to the whole, or universal knowledge. And it follows from this that each science then must understand itself to be incomplete without the other sciences in the university, and each needs to recognize the respects in which the other sciences are also contributing to that whole. So all departments within this ideal university should understand themselves as making a necessary but radically incomplete contribution to the whole of knowledge. Each professor then understands himself not merely as seeking truth as an expert within the bounds of some disciplinary methodology or perspective, but as doing that for the sake of something higher that transcends it, the universe or universal knowledge, or what is the exact same thing for Newman, philosophical knowledge or wisdom. He uses those interchangeably. So Newman's ideal knower is not an expert or a technocrat, but someone who possesses the intellectual virtue of wisdom in his mode of study. For this reason, philosophy, the discipline which is especially concerned with the pursuit of wisdom, has a privileged position in Newman's ideal university, much like it did in the medieval university. Ultimately, what Newman is advocating for is for philosophical knowledge to be communicated within every university discipline, so that when we move towards philosophical knowledge of what we study, right, we can only begin to do this insofar as we see how the truth within our disciplinary mode is related to the truths of other disciplinary modes, and how these truths can reveal a form or a unified body of knowledge that is consistent within itself. And it follows from this that all university creatures, professors and students, will need some training in philosophy. Now, I want to talk about what Newman's account of universal knowledge is for, because this is where happiness and human flourishing enter the picture. The pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of universal knowledge, Newman argues, is good in itself. And it's good in itself because we are knowers, we are rational creatures, and wisdom is a form of intellectual perfection for us, right? So we're talking about an intellectual virtue rather than discrete analytical skills. Indeed, Newman thinks it's the highest power in us, ordered to the highest object we might study, the universe. Thus, as we acquire this habit of mind in our university study, we are advancing in our own flourishing or perfection as a human person. There is no higher goal we could pursue, which is why such an education is truly liberal by Newman's lights. It is befitting a free person, a person whose mind is not narrow, but broad and deep, who can see the forest for the trees, who can connect the particular to the general, who knows how to ask the right sorts of questions in the right context, and most importantly, someone who understands the limits of expertise and who sees clearly the need and the right context for higher and more complex forms of knowledge that are necessary for human flourishing. And a university is important to civilization precisely because it cultivates this higher form of human knowledge. So this is what Newman says. Hence it is that this education is called liberal, for a habit of mind is formed which lasts throughout the life, of which the attributes are freedom, patience, moderation, and wisdom, what I had ventured to call a philosophical habit. This is the special fruit of an education furnished by a university. So the contemplative habit of mind that a liberal education cultivates is good without qualification, again, not because it's useful to some external purpose or goal, but because it contributes to human flourishing. And it does that because it fulfills a natural human desire that we have to know and understand reality, a natural desire that deeply impressed Aristotle in the opening of his Metaphysics and Plato throughout his entire corpus. It is this natural desire, distinctive of the human being, that is properly cultivated by a liberal education. It asks us not merely to seek the truth, but to ascend to the heights of wisdom insofar as we are able, because our fulfillment as human persons depends on this upward movement. Now, what I want to emphasize is that for Newman, there is wisdom to be sought within any university discipline. So he's not saying, hey, you all have to major in philosophy, although that would not be a bad idea. In principle, Newman holds out the promise that we can have wise engineers, wise lawyers, wise biochemists, wise doctors, etc. The key is to develop the philosophical habit of mind as one advances within one's disciplinary bounds, to keep an eye out for that wider horizon of philosophical knowledge of the universe. Because it is the wider horizon that leads us or reminds us to contemplate the ultimate things. And yes, the contemplation of the ultimate things of human existence is and will always be the stuff of wisdom. So let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I am not saying that expertise is bad. I am not saying that expertise should be abandoned. I am not saying that disciplinary research is bad or that it should be abandoned. Expertise and research are both important. But mere expertise and unchecked research can bring great evils into the world. We know this. It's a fact. Technique divorced from wisdom can be shallow, but we should not forget it can also be dangerous. However, we settle these questions about ultimate ends, and we must, in the end, settle them for ourselves. We cannot know how to order our lives, and we cannot know how to flourish in our professions, and we cannot understand the proper limits in place of our expertise until we address them. And the question of ultimate ends is not one that Newman wants to leave to the private sphere. These are questions that properly belong to philosophy and theology and other modes of liberal study, and not in a merely academic or alienated sense. It follows from this, I think, that the pursuit of any disciplinary knowledge within a university must have an ineliminable liberal foundation. So that when we think of general education, when you think of the stuff that you think every university student should study, you should be thinking of a liberal education. And you should be thinking about that in the sense of an education that seeks to instill the habits of mind that are necessary for specialized knowledge to be at its best in service of that higher knowledge of wisdom. So Weber and Fisch's ideal of a knowledge worker living out the research ideal, I think, could not be more foreign to Newman's essentially Aristotelian conception of a university. And I also think it's largely out of joint with the history of universities in the West. For Fisch's knowledge worker is merely an academic expert. I know, I don't like it either. And thus a mere technocrat who limits himself to the inculcation of disciplinary skills in which he has been narrowly trained. I want to suggest that this has nothing to do with liberal learning, even if you're doing that mode of study in philosophy, because there is nothing liberating about being trained to produce scholarship in Fisch or Weber's narrow sense. Fisch's account of the university is then, I think, actually opposed to liberal education rather than being the best reasonable defense of it, as he claims. A merely technocratic approach to higher education understands it as a training for a life of work, whether that is the intellectual work of the professoriate or the practical work of the engineer or the entrepreneur. And while such an education will always have its place, even within the university, a university education cannot be reduced to this and remain higher in any deep or meaningful sense that could contrast it or distinguish it from a trade school. For no matter what career you choose in life, including the career of the professor, you still have to know what your work is for, what your money is for, and what you are living for. But if you're never trained to ask and answer the question of what any of it is for, if you never let yourself wonder in a disciplined and serious way about who and what we are and why we are here and where we are going and why we are going there, then I would suggest that you are not as free as you otherwise might be, and that your free time ends up being nothing more than a brief restorative period that allows you to get back to work more efficiently and productively. I think we are free in the relevant sense to the extent that we have cultivated those philosophical habits of mind that direct us towards wisdom, a vision of what is true, good, and beautiful that actually hangs together and makes sense for us in such a way that we can live meaningful and purposeful lives under it. A liberally educated person has begun the process of reflecting deeply and in a disciplined way about these questions. And such a person understands that a vision of life is necessary for free choice, and that the cultivation of such a vision is the essential task of a truly higher education. This is the cultivation of an interior freedom to flourish as a human person, not an external freedom to choose this or that given untrained or untutored desire. And if the university wants to tell everyone that such freedom is interesting, but is basically none of its business, that these matters should be left to the priests and the prophets and the sages outside of our serious halls, where all study is alienated and depersonalized and measured by its usefulness to some predetermined practical goal, that I would suggest that we really need to question whether there is any difference between a university and a trade school after all. And it seems to me that the difference becomes more obscure every day. Finally, and I promise you this is my last point, I simply want to remind you and people like Stanley Fish and his ilk, who are vaguely embarrassed or perplexed by all this talk of freedom and wisdom, that we have a great cloud of witnesses to the transformative and liberatory potential of a liberal education, from Augustine to Frederick Douglass to Anna Julia Cooper to W.E.B. Du Bois to Martin Luther King Jr. and to my dear friends Roosevelt Montas and Zena Hitz, whose recent and compelling memoirs speak passionately of the freeing of their own minds through the study of the great masterworks of the West. So don't just take my word for it. Listen to those who have undertaken such an education and can bear witness to its fruits. You could also read the testimonials of our own Honors College students at the University of Tulsa, who recently spoke in a really powerful and raw way about what their education has meant to them, of how it has shaped and reshaped and challenged them, and most importantly to me, how it helped them to understand for the first time in their lives that the point of their study is not external to them. It's not to earn a grade or a credential or to help them make a good living, but is internal to them. It is the task of becoming a deeper person who needs to make a life for him or herself. This is the essential and, yes, most basic and noble task of the university. Let us not mock this task, but recommit ourselves to embracing and supporting it. Thanks for your attention. So I take questions. Or objections? Or the screams of children?
Just raise your hand. Thank you so much for this lovely lecture. This reminded me of something I've been reading about lately since your full spread and interesting things. The kind of difference that I find this draws between curiosity that can become a vice versus a sort of virtuous studiousness.
Yes.
And I also saw curiosity as almost a vice in Augustine's Confessions.
Yes.
And I was just curious.
Because it is a vice.
Curiosity versus virtuous studiousness can kind of map on to the discussion a little bit where would you place those?
Yeah, wow, what a good question. Yes, I'm obsessed with studiositas and curiosity. Studiositas is like the neglected virtue of our time because nobody knows what it is. Like if you say studiousness is a virtue, everyone thinks that's just like diligence about doing your homework. And diligence about doing your homework is fine, but it's not what St. Thomas is talking about. He's actually talking about the moderation of that natural appetite to know, because he understands, and he's picking this up ultimately, I think, from Plato. How many people have read the Republic? Okay, excellent. Wow. Yeah, remember that guy who just like can't stop looking at dead bodies? He just has this like morbid curiosity for looking at dead bodies, and he can't stop. And he kind of realizes like it's a little messed up. This is Plato's example of untutored appetite for knowledge, right? He sort of recognizes that this can go haywire, and it can go haywire in so many different ways. It can get, so St. Augustine talks about the lust of the eyes. And his example of this is when you know, like, you shouldn't go to the gladiatorial games, but, like, you just can't stop looking at the gladiatorial games. So it's kind of lust of spectacle. What is it that, like, you're really learning there, right? What is it that you're getting out of it? And I think, like, in a contemporary context, we're all sort of familiar with looking up from our phones and realizing, like, we've been watching Reels or TikToks for, like, 2 hours, and we don't know why or how or what have we learned, you know, and our eyes are glazed over. It's the same sort of thing, right? So this appetite for knowledge can go wonky. It can also get yoked to external goals that end up destroying it. So, for example, your study might just get yoked to your social ambition, and then your study doesn't become freeing or liberatory, but self-destructive. Unfortunately, as in all things, there's so many ways to go wrong, and there's only one way to go right, which is why we need this virtue called studiositas, which is a moderation of that appetite to keep it trained on what is really good for us, so that it is actually leading us towards our flourishing rather than not. I think what's so interesting to me about kind of classical discussions of the vice of curiosity and the virtue of studiousness is that it's born of the recognition that that our capacity for attention is a moral capacity, right? What are you doing when you're studying? You're paying attention to something. It is a sustained act of attention. And what we give our attention to is by and large a choice, right? Especially in a university today, you have a lot of choice. And that means that you need to ask yourself constantly, towards what am I giving my attention and why? Because your attention is you, right? It's your person. And we should all be a bit more discriminating about what we give our attention to, because that sustained act of attention is shaping us in various ways, whether we want to be honest about it or not. Yes.
I want to ask about the idea of like production academia.
You mean like knowledge production?
Yeah. Especially in philosophy, when it tends to be more analytic, it seems like it can be kind of easy for you to focus just on like making every sentence like logically compatible. So how, like beyond the content of what you write about as a philosopher, how do you write it in a way that is actually pursuing wisdom instead of just like reducing to produce something?
Yeah, that's a really, really good and important question, and it's vexed because, there's philosophy and then there's professional philosophy, right? And I'm a professional philosopher who still tries to do philosophy, but it can be hard because the professional philosopher is laughing. No, but it's true because professional philosophy. Philosophy operates the way that almost every specialization operates in the contemporary academy, right? There's something called academic publishing, and that's all ranked. It's a status hierarchy. So it's not just what you publish, but where you publish. And then you look at those journals and you realize, like, wow, that's like a real narrow kind of thing there that they're going to accept. And so your mind gets yoked necessarily to this kind of externalized value system. What will the journal value, right? What is considered new knowledge, right? And it turns out that this is a process of narrowing and narrowing and narrowing and narrowing. And the thing is, when you get together with philosophers, we're going to complain a lot. And we're also going to talk about ways that, at least in my experience, the ways that the professionalization of philosophy we feel has like cramped our passions, but also like cramped what we can inquire about and pursue and talk about. And so I think there's just like a real tension there that is hard to navigate. For myself personally, I just started writing for normies, which entailed a hit to my professional life, but it made me happy. And I was like, you know what, you only live once. I'd like to be happy. But if I do philosophy in the mode that like anyone can read or understand, it's not valued professionally because it's not serious, etc. So I think there's just a tension there, and the tension also shows up in how we teach. And I think that universities need to consider ways in which they might liberate the professoriate from these kinds of pressures. Again, I'm not saying that expertise is bad. I don't hate my own scholarship, but I do think that there is a tension there and a limitation, and I wish that the things that we valued as an institution would open up a little bit. Yeah, it'd just be more capacious. Yes. Do you want to? No, okay. Yes. Yes. Yes.
I have a question that's related to what Andrew asked about the professionalization of philosophy. It's kind of a two-part question. So, if the very ambitious model of university is defined by silos of specialization, knowledge for extrinsic purposes, and an emphasis on more empirical ways of knowing, what kind of knowledge do humanities professors produce? And
empirically or normatively?
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And is the kind of specialized research produced by scientists even possible in humanities? Basically, like, is there even a place for professors in humanities in favor of the model of university?
Wait, sorry, I didn't hear the second half of the question.
No, you're good. Is the kind of specialized research produced by scientists even possible in humanistic disciplines? It seems like the best role of a humanist professor is just to be a professor of liberal arts.
Yeah, so I mean, okay, wow, what a good question. So let me start off with an example because I think it's illustrative of some of the problems that we run into institutionally. So I ran very early on in my career, or I helped to run, I had a co-PI, an interdisciplinary project that involved philosophers, theologians, scholars of religion, and a bunch of different social scientists, everything from personality psychologists to like brain scanning neurologists to sociologists to behavioral economists, etc. And it was a huge multi-million-dollar grant, so it's got to have outputs or outcomes. And so, like an obvious outcome, right, is publication of research. But like the goal of the project was for that research to be interdisciplinary. Well, we all started running up against the limits of the journals that accept our work, right? Because that work is by and large not interdisciplinary, right? So there's a question of like, where does it go? And then the answer was, in an edited volume I make up, right? Because it can go there and it can live there. I'll just make a home for it over here. And this was really the first time in my life that I just thought, wow, like this is messed up. There's no, we can't even create interdisciplinary knowledge because there's nowhere for it to go. Like no one recognizes it. And it was the first time that I started to see wow, this is really defining even what we can think about, the kinds of inquiries we can begin. So it's just a problem. I mean, the balkanization of knowledge is it's almost totalized, right? Because it's not just this is what I can think or teach, because there are also, at my previous institution, it was so hard to co-teach. It was so hard to teach as a philosopher with someone in the sciences. You had to jump through 10,000 hoops, and then you still couldn't do it. So I think there are just lots of institutional barriers to Newman's ideal, and to sort of thinking outside the bounds of very narrow forms of expertise. Something else that I didn't really discuss, but is interesting historically, and this has also to do with the birth of the research university, and if you're super interested in this, I could give you lots of reading. But one thing that happens is that the humanities, the form that the humanities ends up taking basically apes the sciences. So why does a philosophy paper have 72 footnotes? Because somebody decided that was Wissenschaft, right? And historically, philosophy didn't look like that, but it does now. And the answer isn't that philosophers really thought that was better, it's that we got forced into that mold. So, and I think that's deeply questionable.
Thanks, Jen, for a really great talk. Lots for me to think about. I'm wondering about the prospects of re-envisioning or retooling universities going forward based upon going back to this whole vision. And maybe I'll put the question this way. I'm wondering, for all the secularists out there,
Yeah.
if we have any common ground with them to build on.
Yeah.
So maybe the question is so Stanley Fish.
Mm-hmm. Who's religious, by the way?
Okay.
Yeah.
What minimal revisions to his view would be required for you and Stanley to sort of run a university together?
He would have to change. Boy, that's funny. I think, okay, so Okay, so let me, again, just to clarify, like, what I'm not saying. I'm not saying we should go back to, you know, Baylor being a Baptist seminary. Or Harvard being what were they, Congregationalist? I think, yeah. I'm not saying that we should have all male seminaries again. Like, that's not my vision, just to be clear. Because I'm not saying that research is bad. Like, I don't think it's bad that our universities try to cure cancer. I don't think that's bad. I'm not trying to say that. What I am saying is that something has been lost, and it's the essential thing. And so I want to think about ways that the essential thing can be recovered, because in my experience, the essential thing is really hard. And the thing that's hard about it is not the thing that everyone says is hard about it. The thing that everybody says is hard about it is that students have no interest. That is not my experience. My experience, rather, is that the university is uninterested in it. They don't value it. And they don't value it because they can't, well, why don't they value it? I don't know. We don't have enough time to answer that question. But the truth is, I think they just don't, by and large, unless they are pressured to for some reason. And so I think that's just mission drift of a lamentable kind. I think that things are in such a bad state that I am simply interested in experiments in living being performed, right? Like, I don't think I could just sort of like walk into every university and be like, oh, one quick trick and the liberal arts are back. Like, I just think it doesn't work that way. You know, I spent the last 2 years building a college that would recenter liberal learning. And I'm really proud of everything that we did there. What I would like to see is other universities looking for ways to do it. I think the best way to proceed is almost like in a lab, right? Like a control group where you can sort of see like what works and then think about how to sustainably grow that or scale it. You know, I think honors colleges are great, but of course an honors college is always going to be limited because an honors college is typically 10% of the university population. And what we want is, again, for every university creature to have a general education that is liberal. We're not set up to deliver that right now. That's the reality. So I think we have to think about slow and steady progress towards that goal of, and I would state the goal very simply, make general education liberal again. That's the goal. How any institution progresses towards that goal is going to be institution specific. But that is not the goal, right, for most of us. In fact, if you talk to a lot of university administrators, the goal is to have artificial intelligence take over general education. And that's when I'm ready to pack up and go home, personally. Yes?
I think you can take one more question.
Sure. Yes?
Thanks so much for your talk, Dr. Frey. I'm a philosophy PhD student.
Woo!
And my question is, since so many of us here are part of the university, have you the 11 for the university? And have you operate within this wider system that doesn't pursue philosophy as we might want to pursue it? So.
Philosophy is still amazing. And I don't want to, you know, I'm very grateful for my education. I'm incredibly grateful for my education. And I don't want to ever seem like I'm not grateful for it. I had professors who were very interesting people in their own way, but also like very dedicated to the life of the mind. And I'm very grateful for my PhD. I think one thing that was a little bit different about Pitt, which is what my PhD program, is that we were weird in all sorts of ways. But one way in which Pitt was like very obviously weird is that we were not professionalized. So if you like took a grad student from Pitt and you put them next to a grad student from Princeton, like one was hyper professionalized in 5 years and was ready to go, and the Pittsburgh grad student was still like clawing their hair out, like wondering, you know, what was going on. So it was a different environment. Maybe I wouldn't be as weird as I am had I gone to Princeton. Probably that's definitely true. But I do think that every professor, regardless of their discipline, needs to remember that love that they experienced that got them into doing that for life. It's very easy to lose touch of that love because that's not really, we don't live in an educational system that is really designed around that. But that love, like, has to be the reason you became a philosopher, because, like, why else would you become a philosopher? Like, it's crazy. And I'm very interested in the ways in which that love got kind of beaten out of me in grad school, and the way that I see it get beaten out of undergrads, and the way that I see it, like, barely flickering in some professors. And so I think, like, we need to not lose sight of the value and importance of that love, that spark that is really at the root of the life of the mind. You know, contemplation is not cold observation. It is an act of love. And I think that, again, if you just go back to the very simple idea that study is about what you give your attention to, and it's very clear that what you give your attention to is guided by, like, what you want, what you desire in some sense. And so I really think we would be so much better off if we just constantly reminded ourselves that education is really about the proper cultivation of our loves. And because if we did that, we would know that you can't give it over to a robot. Like, we would know that it's personal. We would know that our happiness is at stake. So I really think just, like, always remembering that, which you're going to have to do on your own. Yeah, it's going to have to be a self-discipline. Because professionally speaking, it's not going to happen. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you.
Let's thank Dr. Frey.